Hello everyone. This is the sixth class for the course of Social Psychological Perspectives on Health. In the last class, I talked about how social statuses are related to our health, and such link can be found both among monkeys and as human beings. And I talked about several reasons why there are links between social status and health. One of the reasons I mentioned was sociological or epidemiological models, which argue that social status is also related to different lifestyles, cultures, knowledge, or family structures that may be related to our health. However, some research showed that such link can be found even among the public servants with different social status. This study indicates that even if people share similar lifestyles, cultures, and knowledge, there is still a health gradient. So another reason why we may find a link between social status and health was social capital. So this social determinant of health argues that low status people tend to have less social capital, and social capital is usually related to better health. And because of such lack of social capital among low social status individuals, there is a link between social status and health. And here is so for today's content, here is 10 traditional tips for better health based on the biomedical model. I think these are very familiar to you because these kinds of tips are very common and then people are more familiar with this biomedical model. So let me just read aloud each of them. One, don't smoke. If you can, stop. If you can't, cut down the number of smokes. Two, follow a balanced diet with plenty of fruit and vegetables. Three, keep physically active. Four, manage stress by, for example, talking things through and making time to relax. Five, if you drink alcohol, do so in moderation. Recent studies actually found that the less alcohol you have, the better it is for your health. And if you don't drink any, that's even better for your health. And number six, cover up in the sun and protect children from sunburn. Seven, practice safer sex. Eight, take up cancer screening opportunities. Nine, be safe on the roads. Follow the highway code. 10. Learn the first aid ABCs, airways, breathing, circulation. So as I said, these 10 tips should be very much familiar to you because, the the media or like any kinds of health, how do you say, health recommendation are often based on this biomedical model. Another 10 another tips for better health is based on social determinants model, which may be less familiar to you. One, don't be poor. If you can, stop. If you can't, try not to be poor for long. Two, don't live in a deprived area. If you do, move. Three, I found it wasn't very much appropriate, so I just skipped. Four, don't work in a stressful, low-paid manual job. Five, don't live in damp, low-quality housing or be homeless. Be Six, be able to afford to pay for social activities and annual holidays. Seven, don't be a lone parent. Eight, claim all the benefits to which you are entitled. 9. Be able to afford your own care. 10. Use education to improve your socioeconomic position. So these 10 tips are based on the findings that lower status tend to be related to poor health. Okay, so in order to avoid being poor health, these tips basically argue that you shouldn't be poor. Okay, so you should avoid being in a low status. All right, so there is some of the explanations of why social status is related to health. And now we turn to the social identity approach to social status and health. What kind of explanations, what kind of reasons social identity approach can provide to explain why social status is related to our health? Status is defined as the position of a group in the social hierarchy of a given society or culture relative to other groups, and that which is relevant outgroups. So in animal studies, when I talked about social status or ranks, it was more like a position within a group. Okay. In a group of maybe 8 or 10 monkeys, where you stand, that was a social status. But in social identity approach, when we talk about status, that is more about groups. What kind of status your group has relative to other groups. And this relativity is actually important. Please think about this example. A poor man in Japan could be richer than a man in poor foreign country, but the man in Japan would be less healthy because his health is influenced by the comparison with others whom the man compares every day. So it's not the absolute status of the man. It's the relative status that man perceives compared to other individuals or other groups. Okay. So social identity approach says that relative standing determines health outcomes. It's not the absolute standing, but it's relative standing. How a man understands where he stands in his society is important for his health. Even if he knows that he is on the basis of wealth, he is richer than someone in much, much poor country, but it doesn't help him to be healthier. What determines his health is how he compares himself with someone in the same society. So this is a relevant outgroup. Okay, someone in the poor country is not a relevant outgroup, but someone who lives in the same society in the same country is relevant outgroup that man compares himself with. Okay, so groups and status. Groups' wealth, education, and social standing determines status. So it's really basically which group you belong determines what kind of status, social status you have. You belong to Hitotsubashi University, and that indicates how high your social status is. And then when you start working, which company you work for really determines what kind of social status you have. That's social status in human, like everyday conversation. And then that's the status that social identity utilize to understand how status is related to health. So those who belong to groups with superior wealth, education, and social standing achieve positive identity. And then achieving positive identity leads to an experience of high self-esteem and well-being. And this is especially true if individuals strongly identify with their group. And that means seeing the social identity as an important part of self. So in, I guess, the first or maybe the second chapter, I mentioned several hypotheses, and one of the hypotheses was hypothesis 2, the identification hypothesis. A person will generally experience the health-related benefits or costs of a given group membership only to the extent that they identify with that group. So even if one belongs to a group which has a very high status in the society, if the person does not identify well with that group, then the benefit he or she could get from the membership of the group is very much limited. Only if the person strongly identify with that group, then that person can enjoy the benefit that the group can confer. Okay. And also there was another hypothesis, hypothesis 3, the group circumstance hypothesis. When and to the extent that a person defines themselves in terms of a given social identity, their well-being will be affected by the state and circumstances of the group with which that identity is associated. So the more the higher the social status of the group is, the more a member of that group can enjoy the benefits from that group. And that is depending on the extent to which the person identifies with that group. Okay. And then let me talk about one study done by Sunny and his colleagues. So they argue that people usually identify more strongly with a high rather than low status groups because it gives a positive identity. And then they hypothesize that stronger group identification works as a psychological, or they more like argue that stronger group identification works as a psychological resource, which thus leads to better health. And Sani and his colleagues studied the population of prison girls in Italy and then families in Scotland. So basically, what they found was that when individuals perceive the status of their in-group high, then it leads to stronger in-group identification. And the stronger in-group identification related to better well-being. Okay. So first, there is a positive association between perceived status of in-group and in-group identification. This is because people are motivated to perceive themselves as positive as possible, and then belonging to high status group, it gives them a positive identity. So if they perceive their group is in a high standing, then their group identification increases. Okay. So the higher the status is, the stronger the in-group identification is. So there's a positive association between these first two variables. And then, as we have been seeing, stronger group identification can provide more well-being. So there's a positive association with satisfaction. And then, well, maybe I should write like this. Okay. So there is a negative association between in-group identification and depression, and there's a positive association between in-group identification and satisfaction with life. And also there is a negative association between perceived stress. So the stronger the in-group identification is, the less they experience depressed, the more they satisfied with their life, and the less they experience the less they perceive stress in their life. Okay. So basically, stronger group identification works as a psychological resource. Psychological resource, which leads to better well-being, better health. Okay, and then you might remember there was a similar study. Okay. Yeah, here. So you remember that when they belong to a high status group, then their social identification becomes stronger. So there's a positive association between status of the group and social identification. And we talked that the stronger identification is related to less permeability. So when they have strong social identification, they tend to perceive that it's more difficult to leave the group. The permeability is there is less permeability. And the more they identify with a group, they are unlikely to leave the group. And the higher they perceive the permeability of the group, they are more likely to leave the group. So there's a positive association between permeability and likelihood of leaving the group. So we know that anyway, the status of the group leads to stronger social identification. That is because people are motivated to perceive themselves as well as their group. They are motivated to perceive themselves positive, and they are motivated to gain a positive identity. So if their group has a high status, then they are more likely to strongly identify with their group. And stronger social identification provides psychological resources, which leads to stronger, better well-being. Okay. Um, oh yeah, yeah, we are back. Okay. So links between status group identification, permeability, and likelihood of living. So that's why I just talked. And then the link between perceived status of in-group and in-group identification may be particularly salient. Sorry. The link between perceived status of in-group and the in-group identification may be not so strong when there is a good amount of interaction between members. So when there's not so much interaction between group members, the status really has a strong effect on in-group identification. But when there's a good amount of interaction between members, the status of the group itself may not feed into strong identification, but how positive and how good interaction they have is related to strong identification. And there are some studies showing that a common bond group tend to provide more interaction between members, and such interaction is positively related to strong identification, while common identity group they tend to have less interaction among members, and in such group, status has a strong effect on in-group identification. So it depends on what kind of groups people belong. The link between the status and the in-group identification is weaker, but the basic message here is that the link between social status and health is present because people are motivated to have positive identity, and this high status is positively related to stronger group identification. And stronger group identification can work as psychological resources, and such psychological resources help them to achieve better health. That's the explanation. That's our explanation, I guess. And next, features of social structure context determine response to group disadvantage. So through this point, I have been talking that social status is positively related to health. Higher status is linked to better health. And then I also mentioned that when people belong to high status groups, they tend to have they tend to have better health. And that is because people can strongly identify with the high status group. And that helps them to achieve better health. However, low social status or disadvantaged groups belonging to such groups is not equal to low well-being or low self-esteem. And this is because people in low status groups will search and often find ways to achieve positive identity. So again, belonging to high status group is not only way to achieve positive identity. And we have seen this statement before in hypothesis 4, the identity restoration hypothesis. People will be motivated to restore positive identity when this is compromised by events that threaten or undermine their social identities, like group failure, stigma, low status, or loss of group memberships. So even if they belong to low status group, that's not the end of their good health. There are different ways that they can still gain a positive identity. And then let's see how they do that. Resisting identification with disadvantaged groups. So when they belong to a disadvantaged group, they basically resist identification with such group. And remember, not belonging to a group is not really a cause of good or bad health, but how strongly they identify with a group is a key for their health. And even if they belong to a disadvantaged group, they can still resist identifying with such a group so that they can protect their health. So denial of group membership to disadvantaged group. So example given in the textbook was homeless. So having poor health is often a cause of being homeless. And being homeless could lead to poor health. But the research found that 55% of the homeless described themselves as homeless, while 31% refused to describe themselves as homeless. And then there are different expressions and ways that people refuse to describe themselves as homeless in the textbook. So I strongly recommend you to read that part. And even more interestingly, those who rejected homeless self-categorization reported actually higher well-being. So even if they may be perceived objectively as homeless, if they do not identify with such categorization, if they reject such categorization, then they can protect their well-being from being affected by such categorization. And because of that, if they do not define themselves as homeless, then they tend to show higher well-being. So self-categorization is not an objective status, but active process of identity negotiation. What kind of identity you may want to have, and then how you categorize yourself can really determine what your identity is. So for well-being, how one perceives oneself is more important than how one may be objectively categorized. Okay. So this is really how psychology is important, you know. It's not about which group you belong to, but it's about how you understand yourself as a member of which group. Another strategy an individual could take in order to achieve positive identity is to emphasize identification with a high status group. So as you may understand, people belong to multiple groups and they strengthen and emphasize their identification with a high status group. So people belong to multiple groups, and then some of the groups may be in a low status, while other groups may have a higher status. And in such cases, people tend to emphasize the group identity that has a strong, higher status. And this gives relatively positive identity compared to other low status group identity. And because of that, it reduces negative effects on health and well-being. So, multiple group memberships may reduce that association between group status and self-esteem, while increase association between multiple group membership and psychological health. So because people can emphasize their identification with a relatively positive group among the groups they belong to. Okay, so let me walk through the figure again. As I said, there's a positive link between group status and self-esteem. When they belong to a high status group, they tend to have high self-esteem, and then which should lead to better well-being. But multiple group memberships is also related to better or higher self-esteem. And the reason there is a positive association between multiple group membership and self-esteem, one of the reasons is that when people belong to multiple groups, they could reduce the negative impact of belonging to relatively low status groups and then increase the positive effects of belonging to relatively high status groups. Okay, so because of such emphasis that people could put, the link between group status to self-esteem can be weakened. Okay, regardless of groups they belong. If they belong to more groups, then they have more opportunities to emphasize the group identity that gives them positive identity. Or they could emphasize the group identity of the group that has a higher status. And because of that, like general group status that individual has would have weaker effect on self-esteem. So it's not really objective status of group memberships that people have, but how they perceive the importance of each group membership they have. Okay. Okay, so it has been almost 30 minutes, so I think I will just stop here and then I will continue in the next video.